It was its own world, familiar in some ways, completely different in others, and absolutely delicious. Close your eyes for a moment and step through a door. A kitchen door somewhere in Canada, Ontario, maybe, or New Brunswick, or Manitoba. It doesn't much matter which province, because there's a feeling that belongs to all of them. It is February 1967, Canada's centennial year. Outside, the snow is heaped against the fence in hard blue-white ridges, and the cold presses against the window pane like something alive, looking in. But in here, the kitchen is warm in a way that has nothing to do with thermostat settings. The oil furnace hums somewhere below. The linoleum gleams faintly under the overhead light, and on the back burner of the stove, barely at a murmur, a heavy pot is doing its slow, patient, daily work. The smell alone would stop you in the doorway. Earthy and deep, smoky from the salt pork, warm with the long, slow breath of whole yellow peas that have been simmering since early morning. It is a smell that means winter. It is a smell that means safety. It is, if you grew up in this country, a smell that means home. That pot of pea soup, habitant pea soup, made the old way, the right way, with a ham bone or the remnant of last week's holiday ham, a thick block of salt pork, and a full bag of whole yellow peas that have been soaking since the night BFB. Or that pot has been on the back burner of the Canadian kitchen since before there was a Canada to speak of. The recipe came down the St. Lawrence with the French settlers, took root in the long winters of Quebec, and spread quietly, steadily, westward and eastward, until it was simply part of what this country ate when the cold came. It didn't need a restaurant. It didn't need a cookbook. It needed a mother or a grandmother who knew without measuring, who tasted and adjusted, who understood that patience was the only ingredient you could not substitute. Do you remember the smell of that soup on a school day? Coming in from the cold, your face stinging, your boots caked with salt and snow, and hitting that wall of warmth and aroma. The moment the back door opened, the CBC radio was on. It was almost always on, not as background noise, not in the way a television might have chattered from the next room, but as a presence, a voice, an intelligent, unhurried, distinctly Canadian voice that spoke about the weather in the Maritimes and the price of wheat in Saskatchewan and the hockey scores that every household in the country already knew by heart. Saturday nights belonged to hockey night in Canada, and the kitchen would fill with the tinny electric roar of the broadcast, with the announcer's voice rising over the crowd, and every family member would have an opinion, loudly expressed, between bites of whatever was on the table. But on weekday mornings and weekday evenings, the CBC was simply there, a companion to the woman standing at the stove, stirring, tasting, adjusting, a reminder that the country was large and cold and full of interesting people, and that all of them were listening too. On the counter beside the radio, the tin of red rose tea, the orange Pecco in the black box, a fixture of every Canadian kitchen that did not need explaining or recommending. You bought it because your mother bought it, and your grandmother before her, and the tiny ceramic figurines that occasionally appeared inside the box, a miniature bear, a horse, a robin, were collected in a drawer or on a shelf with the owner. Quiet, unsentimental pleasure of small familiar things. You made it strong, in a proper teapot, or in a mug with a good long steep. I.e., you drank it with milk, and you set the cup beside whatever you were doing, and the day began, or the afternoon softened, or the evening settled in. Now, no. There was one dessert that appeared at every single church supper, every family reunion, every bake sale, every fall fair, and every kitchen table between the Atlantic and the Pacific. And yet, it was almost completely unknown outside the sea. Entree. Dot. Americans had never heard of it. The British had their own version of a treacle tart, but it wasn't this. Australians had their lamingtons, and good for them. But they didn't know what they were missing. Ask any Canadian who grew up in this era, any Canadian at all, and they will smile before you even finish the question, because they know exactly what you're talking about. We'll come back to it, but it matters that you know it was there, right at the beginning, cooling on a wire rack beside the stove, golden and fragrant, filling the kitchen with a sweetness that was specifically, stubbornly, irreducibly Canadian. And there was something else, something that sat on every Canadian table and went into more dishes than most people ever thought to count. Most people south of the border assumed Canadians poured it on their pancakes and stopped there. They had absolutely no idea. The tin shaped like a maple leaf or a little log cabin, the amber liquid inside thick and sweet with a faint smoky complexity that no other sweetener could replicate. That tin of maple syrup was not a luxury in a Canadian kitchen. It was an ingredient. What exactly went into it, how far it traveled from the sugar bush into the everyday cooking of this country, how deeply it ran through the Canadian palate, that too is a story worth telling properly. And we will. But first, what? That kitchen. Picture it fully. The Frigidaire, or the GA refrigerator in one corner, white or pale yellow, humming reliably. The electric kettle on the counter. Canadians had electric kettles long before the Americans thought to adopt them. And anyone who has stood in a Canadian kitchen, watching the water come to a boil in 3 minutes, flat understands that this was not a small quality of life improvement. The kitchen table, covered with an oilcloth or a vinyl cloth in a cheerful print, strawberries or roosters, or a bowl geometric that seemed very modern in 1963, with 4 or 6 chairs pulled in tight, the wooden spoon resting across the lip of the soup pot. Dot. The Crosby's molasses tin, its dark label a staple of maritime and Quebec kitchens, sitting on the shelf beside the baking soda and the salt. Cast iron pan, seasoned over decades of Sunday morning pancakes and Friday night pork chops, heavy and black and permanent. The canning jars lined up on the shelf in the back, filled last September with beet pickles, green tomato chow chow, and wild blueberry jam, each lid sealed tight against the winter, a small act of defiance against the season's length. The linoleum was usually patterned. The curtains at the window were often handmade, cotton in a cheerful print, letting in the pale winter light. And outside that window, in February, the world was white and blue and absolutely silent. The kind of silence that only comes with deep, cold, and heavy snow. Canadian silence. And the kitchen held itself against it, warm and purposeful, smelling of soup and tea and something baking. This is not a story about a Canada that most of the world ever saw. The travel programs of the 1960s showed Niagara Falls and the mountains of British Columbia and the skyline of Montreal during Expo 67. That extraordinary summer of centennial pride when the world briefly looked north and marked. But the real Canada, the daily, intimate, deeply nourishing Canada, was happening in kitchens just like this one, unhurried. Go, unphotographed, and absolutely extraordinary in its own quiet way. What was your family's kitchen like on a weekday morning in winter? Did the CBC come on before the kettle? Or after? The pea soup deserves its own moment, not the tinned version. Although Habitant brand, in its yellow and blue can, was a staple on the shelf for those days when there was no time and no bone to spare. The real thing. The thing that began the evening before with a bag of whole yellow peas submerged in cold water, swelling overnight in a pot on the counter. In the morning, the peas were drained and rinsed, and the process began. A thick piece of salt pork or a ham bone laid in the bottom of the pot. The peas poured over, cold water to cover. Sometimes a chopped onion, sometimes a bay leaf, and then the long, slow hours on the back of the stove, while everything else in the day went on around it. By noon, the smell had spread through every room. By dinner, the peas had given up their shape entirely, dissolving into a thick golden-green broth that was somewhere between a soup and a stew, and tasted like the concentrated warmth of the whole winter. You ate it with bread. Dense white bread or dark rye, buttered heavily, pulled apart with your hands. And if you were very lucky, there was a heel of crusty bread left from yesterday to scrape along the bottom of the bowl. In Quebec, this soup went back centuries, back to the habitant farms along the St. Lawrence, where a pot on the hearth was not a luxury, but a necessity, and where nothing was wasted and everything was made to last. It traveled with the French Canadians who moved west and south, and it settled into the routines of kitchens across the country with the quiet permanence of something that simply works. You did not need to argue for it. You only needed to smell it to understand. Now, the country that ate this soup was not a single country in any simple sense. Stand in a kitchen in Newfoundland in 1967, and you are in a different culinary universe than you would find in Vancouver or Winnipeg or St. John. The miracle, the quiet, unremarked, completely genuine miracle, is that this vast, cold, improbable nation managed to hold all of those worlds together in all of those kitchens and still share a few things that were entirely its own. In Newfoundland, the dinner table in winter might have been built around a jig's dinner, salted beef cooked with cabbage, carrots, turnips, and potatoes. Everything simmered together in the same pot until tender and fragrant with the brin. Of the beef and the sweetness of the root vegetables. Beside it, peas pudding. The split yellow peas tied in a cloth bag and cooked right in the pot with the beef, then turned out in a firm golden round, sliced thickly and eaten with mustard, or a spoonful of the cooking broth. On a Sunday morning, before the dinner was started, there might be toutons, rounds of risen bread dough fried in pork fat in a black pan until golden on both sides and faintly crisp at the edges, eaten with a pour of molasses or a spoonful of partridge berry jam. There is no more Newfoundland breakfast than that. There never was. In Nova Scotia, in the Acadian communities along the southwestern shore, rappie pie was what the kitchen smelled like on a cold Saturday. The old recipe called for raw potatoes grated and then pressed until nearly every drop of moisture was squeezed out, the extracted potato starch discarded, and the dry potato mass combined with a rich chicken broth and layered over pieces of stewed chicken in a deep pan, baked until the surface turned golden and slightly crisp. The texture was unlike anything else, dense, somewhere between a dumpling and a gratin, rich with chicken fat and the long, slow flavor of a properly made broth. It was not a dish you ate in a hurry, and no one would have wanted to, along the Nova Scotia coast. In the brief, bright summer, there was blueberry grunt, an unglamorous name for a deeply comforting thing. Wild blueberries, the tiny, intense ones from the barrens, cooked down a pot with sugar and water, till they were bubbling thickly. Then a soft dumpling dough dropped by spoonfuls on top, and the lid set on tight, so the dumplings steamed in the blueberry steam and swelled and cooked through while the berries thickened below. You served it warm, with cream. The name, they say, came from the sound the berries made as they bubbled under the dumplings. It is the sound of summer, if summer were also a dessert. Do you remember the taste of wild blueberries? Not the cultivated kind, the small ones, the ones that grew low to the ground on the barrens and the hillsides, the ones with a flavor so intensely blueberry that a handful of them tasted like a whole pint of the grocery store variety. If you grew up in Atlantic Canada, or in the Canadian Shield country of Ontario and Quebec, you knew exactly what to do with them. A pie, a grunt, a jam, or simply a bowl with milk and sugar, eaten outside in the August sun with stained fin, gears, and complete, uncomplicated happiness. But before we leave the Maritimes entirely, before we move west through the long, cold corridor of Quebec and Ontario and out onto the wide, flat silence of the prairies, there is one more thing the Maritime kitchen knew. Mustard pickles, the bright, turmeric yellow relish of cauliflower and green beans and pearl onions, vinegary and sweet and slightly spiced, served in a small dish beside the cold meat or the baked beans or the leftover ham from Sunday. And brown bread, not the soft, white sandwich bread, brown bread of the bakery, but the real thing, a dense, dark, molasses-sweetened bread, steamed in a tin can or pudding mold, sliced thickly and eaten with baked beans on a Saturday night, got with the deep, sincere conviction that this was one of the great meals available to any human being, anywhere on earth. Crosby's molasses, the tin with the dark red label, the thick, dark, slightly bitter sweetness that went into the beans and the bread, and the taffy and the gingerbread cookies that sat on the shelf in virtually every kitchen in Atlantic Canada and Quebec, was understood to be simply part of what cooking tasted like. In Quebec, the kitchen in winter was its own world within a world. The French-Canadian table was ancient in a way that few other North American tables could claim. Centuries of adaptation to a cold climate and a long river, drawing on the French traditions that the settlers brought with them and transforming them into something new, something that belonged entirely to this land and these seasons. Tourtière was the centerpiece of the Réveillon table. The midnight supper on Christmas Eve, after midnight mass, when the family came in from the cold stamping snow from their boots, and the kitchen was fragrant with pork and spices. The filling, made with ground pork, and sometimes beef or veal, seasoned generously with savory cloves and a touch of cinnamon, packed into a deep, lard pastry crust, and baked until the top was golden, and the kitchen smelled like Christmas. Every family had its version. Every grandmother knew hers was correct. Pudding chômeur, the poor man's pudding, was simpler and older, and possibly even more beloved. A plain cake batter poured into a pan, and over it, boiling hot, a sauce made with maple syrup and cream, so that the batter rose up through the sauce as it baked, producing something between a cake and a pudding, soaked through with sweetness, served warm in deep bowls. Its name, chômeur, meaning unemployed man or poor man, spoke to its Depression-era origins, when maple syrup was available even when other luxuries were not. And a simple, cheap, warm dessert was not a small thing. It was still on Quebec tables in 1967, as it is today because it is perfect, and nothing about it needs to change. Sugar pie, a single open pastry shell, filled with a mixture of brown sugar and cream and a little flour, baked until the filling set into something between a custard and a caramel, served at room temperature, eaten slowly, in small bites, because the thiao is small bites, because the sweetness was deep and concentrated and entirely satisfying. Not fancy, not dressed up. Simply one of the best things you could do with a short crust pastry and a bag of brown sugar. Further west, in the prairie provinces, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta. The kitchen in the 1960s told the story of immigration more vividly than perhaps any other part of Canada. The Ukrainian and Polish and German communities that had settled the prairies in the late 19th and early 20th centuries had not surrendered their food. They had carried it with them across an ocean and planted it on the plains, and it had taken root in the most literal sense, in gardens and root cellars and church hall kitchens that produced, every year, great quantities of pierogies. Though those say half-moon dumplings of thin dough filled with potato and cheddar, or sauerkraut and mushroom, or cottage cheese and potato, boiled and then fried in butter with onions until the edges turn golden, and cabbage rolls, the ground beef and rice wrapped tight in softened cabbage leaves and baked slowly in a tomato sauce until everything was tender and fragrant and deeply, richly satisfied. Borscht, deep purple-red from the beets, thick with cabbage and beef, served with a heavy pour of sour cream. Kielbasa, the smoked sausage, sliced and fried, or added to soup, or eaten cold with rye bread and mustard. These were not exotic dishes in Winnipeg in 1967. They were Tuesday night dinner. They were what you brought to the church supper. They were what your neighbor left on the porch in a covered dish when someone was sick or grieving or had just had a baby. The prairie kitchen was a kitchen that understood that food was not just sustenance. It was continuity, identity, connection to a history that stretched back across the ocean. Out west. In British Columbia, the kitchen was shaped by its own particular geography and its own particular immigrants. The Japanese fishermen whose communities had been so violently disrupted by the war. The Chinese Canadians whose food had been part of the urban fabric since the gold rush. The English settlers who had built Victoria in the image of a very certain idea of England, and still took their afternoon tea with considerable seriousness. And there was something else, something that was born in the lower mainland, in the 1950s, in a home kitchen in Nanaimo, a no-bake layered bar of such genius that it spread across the country quietly and permanently. A base of butter, cocoa, graham cracker crumbs, shredded coconut, and walnuts pressed firm and chilled. A middle layer of custard-flavored buttercream, thick and sweet. A top layer of dark chocolate ganache, glossy and smooth, cut into squares, cold from the refrigerator. A Nanaimo bar was, and remains one of the great achievements of the Canadian kitchen. There is no other name for it. There is no need for one. On the prairies, the Saskatoon berry, that round, blue-purple fruit that grew wild on the plains and in the river valleys, with a flavor like a blueberry crossed with an almond, appeared in pies and jams and cobblers every summer with every summer, with the faithfulness of a prairie ritual. A Saskatoon berry pie, baked in a double crust with a little sugar and a squeeze of lemon, was not a dish you could buy in New York or Chicago or London. It was a dish you could eat on a farmhouse porch in Saskatchewan in July while the wheat field turned gold in the afternoon sun, and nowhere else. What was the one dish that you grew up eating, that you thought the whole world knew, and then you found out that it was entirely, specifically yours? Now we arrive at spring, and spring in Canada in the 1960s meant one thing before it meant anything else. Before the garden was planted, before the ice went out on the lakes, before the first robins landed on the still gray lawn, it meant the maple sap was running. In Quebec, in Ontario, in the small communities along the Shield, the sugar bush was a seasonal gathering that was also something closer to a ceremony. The trees, the sugar maples, their trunks tapped with metal spigots, the sap running clear and cold into tin pails that rang with a pure, sweet sound when the drops fell, were the first living things of the year to offer something. And Pep Oppo came to collect it with a gratitude that was not always spoken, but was always present. The sap ran in the brief, impossible window when the days were above freezing, and the nights still dropped below, and the time was short, and the work was continuous. And the reward was the thick, amber syrup that came out of the evaporator, in clouds of sweet steam, smelling of the season itself. If you were a child, and if you were fortunate enough to go to the sugar bush in March, you tasted maple taffy. The syrup, boiled to a precise temperature, was poured in long, thin ribbons onto clean-packed snow, or snow pressed flat in a tray brought out from the house, and it cooled almost immediately, thickening from liquid to a soft, elastic west. Tensely sweet candy that you rolled onto a popsicle stick and ate right there, standing in the cold in your boots and your heavy coat, the steam rising around you, the taste of pure maple on your tongue. There is nothing else quite like it. There has never been anything quite like it. And if you have not tasted maple taffy on snow, on a cold March morning in a Canadian sugar bush, there is a specific, irreplaceable experience of this country that you have simply not had. The maple syrup that came home in the spring, in the tin shaped like a cabin or a maple leaf, or in glass bottles that caught the light, was not reserved for pancakes. That is what the people south of the border never understood. Maple syrup went into the baked beans, replacing or supplementing the molasses, deepening the sweetness with its particular complexity. It went into the glaze for the Easter ham. It went into the pastry for the tarts. It went into the dressing for the salad in summer. It went into the sauce for the salmon. It was poured over ice cream and stirred into oatmeal and drizzled over the fresh snow that children packed into bowls to make their own crude version of the sugar shack treat. It sat on the table, always, in the way that salt and pepper sat on the table, not as a condiment for a single dish, but as a flavor that belonged to the whole meal, to the whole kitchen, to the whole country. Did you go to the sugar bush when you were young? And did you stand in the cold and eat the taffy straight from the snow? Summer arrived late in most of Canada and left early, and because of that, it was treated with a certain urgency, a certain grateful intensity, as though everyone knew the window was narrow and intended to use every hour up. The kitchen in July was a different place than the kitchen in February. Lighter, the curtains pushed back from the open window, the screen door banging as children ran in and out, the CBC still playing but now broadcasting baseball, and locked. Al Fairs and the long easy news of a country in its brief warm season. The soup pot was on the shelf. The cast iron pan might hold corn on the cob, but more likely that was done outside, boiled in a pot over a backyard fire or on a camp stove, eaten immediately, with a full block of butter and a shaker of salt in the acknowledgement that is this exact moment of the year, this specific sweetness of corn that had been in the field that morning, was not something to take for granted. Wild blueberries in August, strawberries in June, the short season ones, small and intensely red, nothing like what you would find in a grocery store in January. Raspberries in July, picked with scratched arms from thorny canes along fence lines and roadsides. Bumbleberry pie, the kitchen sink pie, the everything pie. The combination of whatever berries and fruits were ready at the same moment, baked together under a top crust that came out fragrant with the mixed sweetness of 6 different thin GS, was summer itself in a pie shell. And then, quietly, September arrived, and with it the most serious work the Canadian kitchen would do all year. The canning was not optional. It was the preparation for survival. Not dramatic survival, not the survival of the frontier, but the quiet, practical survival of a family that knew the winter was long, and the grocery budget was finite, and the food that came out of the garden in September was food that would appear on the table in January, transformed by heat and vinegar, and a sealed lid into something that held the taste of the warm season against the cold one. There was a satisfaction in it that went beyond the practical. A satisfaction that was also pride, also continuity, also the deep pleasure of a full shelf in October, when the wind was already turning sharp. The kitchen in September smelled of hot vinegar and dill and ripe tomatoes, and the particular sweetness of cooking fruit, and the steam from the canning pot rose to the ceiling and condensed on the window glass, and the radio played, and the radio played. Jars were lined up on the counter to cool and seal with the small decisive pop that meant everything had gone right. The fall preserving season was not a hobby in a Canadian kitchen in 1967. It was a necessity, and it was conducted with the focused, methodical efficiency of someone who understood that the winter would be long, and the grocery bill mattered, and the root cellar needed to be full before the first hard frost. The jars came down from the shelf. The blue ball jars and the clear ones with the rubber-sealed lids, and the kitchen filled with steam, and the sharp, bright smell of vinegar, and the sweetness of cooking fruit, and the whole operation went on for weeks, starting with the last of the tomatoes and the green ones that would not ripen, and moving through beets, beans, cucumbers, and wild blueberries, and ending with the last of the apple butter and the pickled green tomato chow butter and the pickled green tomato chow. That was the pride of every maritime and Quebec kitchen. Chow chow. Not the dog. The relish. Bright with red and green tomatoes and onions and vinegar and sugar and turmeric. Tangy and sweet and slightly sharp. Served from a small jar at the side of the plate with cold meat or baked beans or a Sunday roast. Every grandmother had her recipe. Every recipe was slightly different, and the row of jars lined up on the cold room shelf in October, labeled in pencil in a hand that might have belonged to a woman born in 1910 or 1920 or 1930, represented a kind of practical love that did not need to announce itself. The root cellar. If you had one, and many Canadians still did, even in the towns, in the 1960s, it was packed in October with potatoes and carrots and turnips and cabbages, their earthy smell drifting up through the house, like the smell of the ground at sea. Health, cold and fecund and permanent. You went down with a flashlight and a basket, and you chose what you needed for tonight, and the rest stayed cold and dark and waiting. This too was the Canadian kitchen. Not dramatic, not celebrated, simply reliable and real. And now, the tart. We have been circling it long enough, and it deserves the full attention it was given on every bake sale table, every church supper dessert plate, every family reunion spread, every fall fair where it competed fiercely for the blue ribbon, in a category that everyone took more seriously than they perhaps admitted. The butter tart is the quintessential Canadian dessert. There is no other reasonable candidate. It is not complicated. A short, flaky pastry shell, small enough to eat in 2 bites if you had no self-control, or 4 bites if you were being correct, filled with a mixture of butter and sugar and golden syrup and egg, that in the oven syrup an egg that, in the oven's heat, set into something that was simultaneously crisp at the edges and soft at the center, and sticky in the most satisfying way. That filling, sweet, rich, with a faint, almost caramel depth, was not like anything the Americans had in their cookie tins or their dessert cases. It was not a pecan pie, though there was a family resemblance. It was not a treacle tart, though the British tradition was somewhere in the DNA. It was specifically, stubbornly its own thing. And then there was the question that divided families without ever quite dividing them, that was argued at kitchen tables and bake sales and church halls with an affectionate intensity that never quite crossed into genuine disagreement, because everyone understood that the person on the other side of the argument was not wrong, merely differently correct. Raisins or no raisins? The raisin faction held that the plump, dark raisins, swelling in the sweet filling as the tart baked, added a texture and a depth of flavor that the plain version lacked. The anti-raisin faction, equally convinced, argued that the filling was the thing, that it needed no distraction, that raisins were an interruption of something that was already perfect. Both were right. Both were wrong. The argument was never resolved. And this was entirely appropriate, because the butter tart was not meant to be resolved. It was meant to be eaten, still warm if possible, with a cup of red rose tea, and whatever position you held on the raisin question was your own, inherited from your mother or your grandmother, or arrived at through your own personal tasting experience, and it was as much a part of your identity as your hockey team or your province. There was also the question of the filling, runny or firm, which was really a question of baking time and filling consistency. And on this too, families held strong position. The runny filling just barely set, so that when you broke the pastry, the center flowed slightly. That was one school of thought. The firm filling set all the way through, so that the tart held its shape and could be eaten neatly. That was another. And the pastry itself was a matter of deep conviction. Lard produced a flakier, more tender crust than butter. But some families had switched to shortening, and some purists had never wavered from the block of lard in the refrigerator that their mothers and grandmothers had used since before anyone could remember. What was your family's butter tart recipe? And were you a raisin household, or did you know better? The butter tart appeared at the church supper because someone always brought them, and the plate was always empty before the baked beans were gone. It appeared at the fall fair in a box of 12, and the ribbon went to whoever had perfected the pastry that year. It appeared at the Christmas table alongside the tourtière and the shortbread and the date squares. The matrimonial cake, with its oat base and its thick, sweet filling of cooked dates and its crumb topping, which was perhaps the most acute, rightly named dessert in the history of Canadian baking, because it was reliably present at every family occasion where something needed to be brought and eaten in quantity. The date square, the Nanaimo bar, the butter tart, the butter tart. These were the three great pillars of the Canadian church basement dessert table, and any Canadian of a certain age can close their eyes and see all three of them, arranged on a paper plate with a small pile of shortbread under a folding table covered with a paper cloth in the basement of a United Church or a Catholic parish hall, while someone's father poured coffee from an enormous percolator, and someone's mother wrote the price on a small card, and the building smelled of spardia, floor wax, and the wool coats of several dozen cold Canadians who had come in from the parking lot for the annual fall supper. The centennial year, 1967, put a small deliberate burst of national pride into the Canadian kitchen. The Expo 67 tea towels appeared on the oven handle. The commemorative tins and the maple leaf decorations came out. The CBC broadcast special programs about Canadian food and Canadian culture, and families gathered around the kitchen table to listen the way families had gathered around the radio for decades. Canada was 100 years old, and for a country that was not naturally inclined to loudness about its own virtues, it was a moment of genuine, warm, uncomplicated pride. The kitchen, which had always known what it was and where it came from, simply continued doing what it had always done. It fed the family. It kept the cold out. It held the country together, one pot and one tart and one cup of tea at a time. That centennial summer, when Montreal was alive with the color and noise of Expo 67, and the world had come to look at Canada with something like genuine astonishment, had looked at the pavilions and the St. Lawrence and the city itself and found it, perhaps to its surprise, beautiful and sophisticated, and entirely itself. The Canadian kitchen, back home in Hamilton, and Saskatoon, and Moncton, and Victoria, was still making butter tarts, still simmering the pea soup, still pouring the red rose tea. The country could be impressive on an international stage, and it was, and that mattered. But the real Canada, the one that would outlast the centennial banners in the Expo pavilions, the one that was being built day after day in the unglamorous, essential, deeply human space of the family kitchen, that Canada was the one the tea did not need an audience. It only needed itself. This country's kitchen also held, if you listened carefully, the older traditions that predated all of the European arrivals by thousands of years. The bannock, the simple, dense bread that had been part of indigenous foodways, and then adapted through trade and contact into something that appeared in kitchens and camps across the country, was on tables from Newfoundland to British Columbia. It was fried in a pan or baked in an oven, made from flour and lard and a little baking powder. And it was not a relic or a curiosity. In the communities where it had always been made, it was still dinner bread in 1967, still the thing you broke with your hands, and ate with soup or stew, still warm from the pan, and slightly crisp at the edges and impossibly comforting. Wild rice, harvested from northern lakes by Anishinaabe and Ojibwe communities, with the long-practiced expertise of generations, had its place in the Canadian pantry. Cooked with butter and served alongside a roast or bird, it tasted of the northern lake country, nutty and slightly smoky, with a texture that was entirely unlike the white rice that sat in the box on the shelf. It was food that came from a specific place, on this land, harvested by hands that had done this work for longer than anyone who cooked with it could fully comprehend. Pemmican, the preserved mixture of dried meat and rendered fat and dried berries that had sustained travel and trade and survival across the continent for millennia, was the ancestral provision that made the vastness of this country navigable. These were not separate from the story of the Canadian kitchen. They were the foundation beneath it, the oldest layer of a cuisine that was always, in every generation, being built by more hands than any single tradition could account for. The Canadian kitchen in the 1960s was not a simple place. It was British in its love of a proper pot of tea and a Sunday roast with potatoes. It was French in its devotion to a long-simmered soup and a good spiced pork pie. It was Ukrainian and Polish and German in its pierogies and cabbage rolls and dense dark breads. It was indigenous in its wild rice and its bannock and its deep, practical knowledge of the land's abundance. And it was entirely its own in its butter tarts and its Nanaimo bars and its maple syrup on snow, in its red rose tea and its habitant pea soup and its Crosby's molasses and its jars of chow chow, lined up on the cold room shelf. It was a kitchen that did not shout. It did not perform. It did not ask to be admired. It simply did its work. Through the long winters and the brief summers, through the generations and the seasons, and the food it produced was warm and honest and deeply, quietly extraordinary. The Americans, next door, noisy and abundant and confident in their own extraordinary food culture, never quite knew. They had their Thanksgiving pies and their county fair cobblers and their grandmother's recipes written on index cards, and those things were real and beautiful in their own right. But they had never tasted a butter tart still warm from the oven. They had never sat down to a bowl of habitant pea soup after a February afternoon of ice skating on a flooded backyard rink. They had never eaten maple taffy rolled onto a stick from a tray of packed snow while the steam from the evaporator rose in clouds around them. They had never looked down at a church supper plate and known without thinking that the date square and the Nanaimo bar and the butter tart were all present, and that all was right, and that this was home. They did not know what they were missing, and perhaps that was all right. Some things do not need to be shared to be cherished. The pea soup is still on the back burner. It has been simmering since morning. The whole yellow peas have dissolved into a thick, golden, smoky warmth that smells of salt pork and patience, and the particular comfort of a cold country that knows how to feed itself. The red rose tea is in the pot. The butter tarts are on the rack, cooling, their golden pastry gleaming under the kitchen light, their sweet filling still fragrant from the oven. The CBC is playing quietly on the counter. Not hockey tonight, just the measured, unhurried voice of a man talking about the weather coming in from the west, and the news from Ottawa, and something that happened today in a small town in Newcott, Brunswick. That was interesting enough to mention. Outside the window, the snow is falling softly. It has been falling since afternoon, and by morning the fence will be buried, and the path to the door will need shoveling again, and the cold will press against the glass with its familiar, insistent weight. But in here, everything is warm and certain, and exactly as it should be. This is what it was. This quiet, resilient, extraordinary world, built over centuries by French settlers and British colonists and Ukrainian farmers and Newfoundland fishermen and Acadian communities and prairie homesteaders and indigenous peoples whose knowledge ran deeper than all of it, built around the back burner and the bake sale table and the church basement supper and the sugar bush in March and the berry patch in August and the root cellar in October. Built around the pot of pea soup that was always, on a cold day, exactly what was needed. When did you last taste a real homemade butter tart? The pastry still slightly warm, the filling sweet and rich and just yielding enough. Or sit down to a bowl of habitant pea soup after a day out in the cold. And do our children know what they are missing? Perhaps the most important thing to say about the Canadian kitchen of the 1960s is this: it knew what it was. It did not need validation from the South. It did not require the attention of the food media or the approval of the international press. It had its own logic, its own rhythm, its own deep knowledge of what the season required and what the table needed and what the family gathered around it deserved. It was confident in the quiet, understated, particularly Canadian way, the way that does not announce itself, that does not raise its voice, that simply does the work and leaves the result on the rack to cool. The butter tart debate will never be resolved. The raisin faction and the plain faction will argue until there are no more church suppers to bring them to, and the argument itself is part of the thing, as Canadian as the argument over hockey strategy or the best route through the snow. The pea soup recipe has been passed down so many times that it no longer needs to be written, because the hands that make it learned it from watching and tasting and adjusting, and the recipe lives in the body now, not the cookbook. The tin of red rose tea on the counter is not a brand choice. It is a continuity, a small daily act of being the person you were raised to be, in the place you were raised to be in. And the maple syrup in the cabin-shaped tin, the amber liquid, thick and sweet and complex, belongs on every table in every season, not as a luxury or a novelty, but as what it is. The taste of the land itself, collected in March from trees that have been doing this longer than anyone can remember. It was its own world. It will always have been its own world. And if you are lucky enough to have grown up in it, to have smelled that pea soup, and tasted that butter tart, and heard that voice on the CBC, and felt the warmth of that kitchen against the cold weight of a Canadian winter, then you carry it with you, not as a memory, exactly, as something more permanent than that, as the knowledge of what home tastes like, and the quiet, deep, uncomplicated gratitude that you were there to taste it. Sit down. Dog do do. The soup is ready. The tea is made. The butter tarts are cool enough to eat. You are exactly where you belong.